Back in, you got the top. Yeah. All right. Hey, do you know what?
So it's already recorded.
Oh, it's great. Okay,
Yeah,
perfect.
It's going, and we get one of your.
I am. Thank you very much. All right, well, we'll get started. Thank you for coming to the second of our Law in Context series. We had an extremely successful first Law in Context series involving natural law and the question of the relation of law, theology, and law and God. The last time we Professor Bill Rooney, and now we are very fortunate for our second Law in Context series to hear from Lewis Brown, who and he's going to speak to us about healthcare law and policy through the lens of Catholic anthropology. I just want to introduce Lewis briefly to all of you. Lewis is the associate director of our center, and let me give you a little bit of background. After going to law school at Howard University, he worked as an attorney in private practice, where he practiced labor law and commercial litigation. He later served as associate director of social concerns for a state Catholic conference, where he advocated for the unborn, the materially impoverished, immigrants at the state legislature. While at the conference, his work included advocacy on healthcare, co-leading a coalition in favor of housing non-discrimination legislation, advocating for in-state tuition for undocumented immigrants, and seeking to protect generally the social safety net for the poor. He went on after that to become a congressional staffer on Capitol Hill, where he served as a California congressman's legislative counsel and his liaison to the United States House Committee on the Judiciary. As one of the congressman's advisors on the Judiciary Committee and on Judiciary Committee matters, he worked on issues ranging from the reauthorization of the FISA Amendments Act to oversight of the United States Department of Justice. So that's a lot of breadth. Yeah. He is, as of 2014, joined the Christ Medicus Foundation, which is a Catholic healthcare nonprofit whose mission is to share the healing love of Jesus Christ through defending religious freedom, making Catholic healthcare accessible to the poor and the most vulnerable. And in 2017, he began serving at the United States Department of Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights. And during his time at HHS, he enforced vital federal civil rights laws to protect and defend the civil rights of patients and human service recipients. He returned to CMF in 2019. He serves now as its executive director, and we are just delighted. May I add on a personal level, he's just the most wonderful, warm, delightful person. We're extremely lucky to have him here at the law school. You are lucky to be able to listen to him. Please join me in welcoming my friend, Louis Burke.
Okay, great to be with you all. Thanks for the kind introduction. Mark and I initially met in person last summer at a wonderful religious liberty summit, and his wife and his son, and the law school so blessed that we captured him from New York City, and he's now here with us in DC. So just, so grateful to serve as associate director under his great leadership of the center, and also under the leadership of Elizabeth Kirk. I think I have one of my students from my last semester. I taught some of what you're going to hear, on healthcare, and I don't know if there's going to be any more students from that class, but it was a wonderful experience. Really enjoyed it teaching you guys last semester. So great. I also want to thank Bill Rooney, for whom I have great esteem for him. Bill does a wonderful job of acting as a Catholic lawyer and drawing upon the eternal riches of the church's teaching. And as he and I, as Elizabeth and Bill, or excuse me, as Elizabeth and Mark said, Professor Kirk and Professor Girolami said, consider this law series. Bill and I sought to particularly help those students, you who are here as law students, and if there's folks here from other professions, studying other professions here at the university, to really live out the fullness of your vocations, particularly for those of you who are lawyers, and to do so in an integrated manner. Now, I've been practicing law for about 16 years. And so this lecture on healthcare law and policy through the lens of Catholic anthropology in parts draws on my experiencing practicing labor law and civil litigation, where we had massive issues dealing with healthcare. It also draws on my experience in Congress and at HHS, and largely from the course that I taught last semester, Human Dignity and Religious Freedom and Healthcare. So over the last 5 years, our world has experienced plague, regional wars in Europe, the Middle East and Africa, global economic downturn, political division, fierce theological debates about marriage, sexuality, and family, the rise of artificial intelligence, highly contested healthcare debates concerning basic matters of human dignity, and heated legal and political battles about fundamental truths of human existence. To some, it may seem that virtually every societal institution and every basic aspect of our lived experience is up for grabs to be radically altered or manipulated in a million different ways. Everything seems on the table. These events in history, particularly over the last 5 years, have taught us many things. One thing these events have surely taught us is that to do justice, law cannot be practiced in a vacuum. To do justice, laws must be made, and law must be practiced in the full light of truth. To put it another way, to be a lawyer that acts justly in today's world, knowing the black letter law is insufficient. It's necessary, but it's insufficient. To be a lawyer that acts justly in our times, a lawyer needs to understand who man is, what man is made for, and why man exists. So using this light of truth that we have through faith and reason from the gospel, from Christ's apostles' teaching authority that we call the magisterium, the church's magisterium. This lecture seeks to, and as so far as we can in 35 or 40 minutes, answer who man is. What man is made for. And by man, I mean, of course, men and women. The nature of human dignity and human dignity's implications for healthcare, why healthcare is actually necessary. And then I'll briefly articulate a vision of healthcare that aims to be worthy of the dignity of the human person. What I'm going to sketch out from a law and policy perspective, and also what I'm going to sketch out in terms of Catholic anthropology, is not exhaustive. What I seek to do in this lecture is hit on some of the main points, particularly given the context of healthcare, of who we are as human beings, and some of the top level 30,000 foot principles for healthcare law and policy, given the reality of who we are as persons. So the highest calling of any lawyer is to live, act, and work as a fully human person who practices law and administers justice within the reality of God's relationship to man, man's relationship to God, and man's relationship to each other. That is to say, the highest calling at the highest level of any lawyer is to pray and to work within the reality that God is love, and that each lawyer, in his or her own way, is called to receive and give that love to others. Pope Benedict XVI, at the beginning of his incredible encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, says that God is love, and he who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. These words from the first letter of John express with remarkable clarity, this is still Pope Benedict, with remarkable clarity, the heart of the Christian faith, the Christian image of God, and the resulting image of mankind and its destiny in the same verse. St. John also offers a kind of summary of the Christian life. We have come to know and to believe in the love God has for us. Pope Benedict goes on to say that God's eternal love for man is the central truth of all existence. We have come to believe in God's love. In these words, the Christian can express the fundamental decision of his life. He continues, being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. St. John's Gospel describes that event in these words, still Benedict. God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should have eternal life. Benedict concludes in what I'm quoting. In acknowledging the centrality of love, Christian faith has retained the core of Israel's faith, while at the same time giving it new depth and breadth. So from the Catholic vision, which I assert is the true reality, we know that God is a sign of love, is love itself, that man is made by God out of God's love for man, that man's deepest hunger, his or her deepest longing, is for communion with God. The Catechism of the Catholic Church asserts that the desire for God is written on the human heart because man is created by God and for God. And God never ceased to draw man to himself. Only in God will he find the truth and happiness he never stops searching for. The Catechism then quotes the renowned Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world. This was promulgated by Paul VI in 1965. In Gaudium et Spes, the Second Vatican Council powerfully proclaims that the dignity of the human person comes from God. The Second Vatican Council confirms that the meaning of human life and the purpose of human existence is communion, not with ancient structure or with a relic, but with the eternal, living, breathing God. It says, the dignity of man rests above all on the fact that he is called to communion with God. This invitation to converse with God is addressed to man as soon as he comes into being. For if man exists, it is because God has created him through love, and through love continues to hold him in existence. He cannot live fully according to truth. He cannot live fully according to truth unless he freely acknowledges that love and entrust himself to his creator. It's kind of like another way of saying it, to bring this down to reality, is like, as much as you love that great beer or that amazing dinner or that wonderful first kiss with your wife after you get married, it doesn't fully satisfy. Only God satisfies. So God is love itself. And love has come down on this earth through a human person, Jesus Christ, to free us, to heal us of sin, sickness, and even death, and through this healing, to reunite us with love forever. And so man is made by love for love. This is the meaning of life. I remember watching the film City Slickers, which probably most of you are a little bit too young to remember. Who remembers City Slickers? Right? And Billy Crystal's like, what's the meaning of life? Is Curly going to tell him the meaning of life? And it gave this impression to me as a young, preteen, 11, 12 years old, that the meaning of life was some big thing that we had to discover. That like it was this huge mystery. God's not hiding the ball. We know what that is. We know it from our own human experience. We know it from reason, and we also know it from the teaching of the church. So God has created each person to receive and give love, and through God's healing, to prepare each person to return to love itself. How can this be? In a world where seemingly from the beginning, humanity constantly experiences overwhelming sin and human evil, how could this beautiful vision of the human person hold? This reality for which the human person exists survives because God has come to heal and reclaim human creation as sons and daughters of the King. In the Catholic vision of the human person, Christ is the divine physician. He is the divine healer. He calls man in to participate in this work of healing, chiefly through a personal relationship with him, through divine grace, that the church administers through the sacraments, through the power of the Holy Spirit, and through the people, all of us, the mystical body of Christ. In this Catholic vision for the human person, all persons in all institutions of civil society are called to witness to and advance this work of healing by seeking justice, upholding the natural law, respecting and protecting the equal human dignity and rights of all persons, and by seeking to sacrificially love and care for the good of others. Now we'll briefly explore aspects of the Catholic vision of the human person and apply that vision of the person and its implications for healthcare law and policy. Despite all the evil that we have in our world, the trauma, the sin, the disappointment, the disease, the illness, the vision of the human person holds that seems so detached from the reality we live day in, day out, because Christ has come here on earth as the divine physician for our bodies and our souls, even before he comes in the fullness of the kingdom of God. As Peter Kreeft taught in a class I once took, in the book In the Lord of the Rings, one of my favorite books, we see a poignant example of Christ coming first as healer, even before he comes in the fullness of his glory. In Lord of the Rings, Aragorn is the heir to the kingdom of Gondor. But he doesn't enter first as king of Gondor and to sit on his throne. What does he come first and do? He goes to the houses of healing. He comes in the city to renew, to restore, to heal, to treat, to care for the wounds of the citizenry, those who have been traumatized, those who have been suffered, at least in the book, perhaps unspeakable tragedy. Similarly, Christ is the divine physician who comes to heal and restore man from every kind of evil before he comes in the fullness of his glory in the second coming. Christ, the divine physician, literally founded what we understand today to be healthcare when he began his healing ministry in Israel and the Middle East nearly 2,000 years ago. Christ, the divine physician, went from town to town, supernaturally healing the sick and suffering in body and soul and delivering people from demonic afflictions. In the gospel according to Matthew, we enter into the beautiful work of Christ, the divine physician. Quote, while he was saying these things to them, an official came forward, knelt down before him and said, my daughter has just died, but come, lay your hand on her and she will live. Jesus rose and followed him, and so did his disciples. A woman suffering hemorrhages for 12 years came up behind him and touched the tassel on his cloak. She said to herself, if only I can touch his cloak, I shall be cured. Jesus turned around to her and said, courage, daughter, your faith has saved you. And from that hour, the woman was cured. When Jesus arrived at the official's house and saw the flute players and the crowd who were making a commotion, he said, go away. This girl is not dead, but sleeping. And they ridiculed him. When the crowd was put out, he came and took her by the hand, and the little girl arose. The Gospel of Matthew continues this account of Jesus' healing. Jesus went around to all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and curing every disease and illness. In this work of Christ, we witness the divine physician and the birth of Catholic healthcare, and indeed all healthcare. Christ is truly the divine physician, and his ministry through his church here on earth is chiefly concerned with healing and restoring what has been broken and lost. Dr. Bob Schuchts, the extraordinary Catholic psychologist and the founder of the John Paul II Healing Center in Tallahassee, Florida, in his book, Be Healed, which I highly recommend to everyone here, demonstrates the depth and breadth of Christ's healing ministry for all humanity. He draws upon Pope Benedict XVI words in his book, Jesus of Nazareth. In Jesus of Nazareth, Pope Benedict, one of the greatest theologians and minds in all of church history, says, quote, healing is an essential dimension of the apostolic mission and of Christianity. When understood at a sufficiently deep level, this, and by this he means healing, expresses the entire content of redemption, period. Healing. This healing ministry of Jesus Christ, who came first as a divine physician, literally created healthcare. The teaching ministry and healing of Christ initiated the practice of caring for the sick and the suffering simply because of each person's God-given dignity. Early Christian communities continue this practice. The same is true of the hospital concept, which early Christian communities created to continue the Christian healing ministry. The scholarship of Professor Gary Ferngren in his book, Medicine and Healthcare in Early Christianity, and the scholarship of Professor Charles Camosy in his book, The Secularization of Medicine, demonstrate that before Christ, the healthcare system that we enjoy today simply did not exist. The redemption for man, the redemption of man for which Christ came is accomplished through healing. Through healing us, Christ enables us to live in the communion for which man is made. Each person is made for communion with God and to be in a communion of loving relationships with other people. Paragraphs 44 and 45 of the Catechism states, man is by nature and vocation a religious being, coming from God, going toward God. Man lives a fully human life only if he freely lives by his bond with God. Man is made to live in communion with God in whom he finds happiness. And then quoting St. Augustine in Confessions, when I am completely united to you, there will be no more sorrow or trials, entirely full of you, my life will be complete. Pope Benedict XVI draws on this even further in his 2006 general audience, that man is made for communion, and through this communion is enabled to experience the fullness of human flourishing on this side of heaven. Communion, Pope Benedict says, is truly the good news, the remedy given to us by the Lord to fight the loneliness that threatens everyone today. The precious gift that makes us feel welcomed and beloved by God. In the unity of his people gathered in the name of the Trinity, it is the light that makes the church shines forth like a beacon raised among the people. What does this mean? And you'll some of you that this material is new, it's interesting. We're called to live Eucharistically. The science all bears it out. We're called to live in communion with God, and we're called to live in a communion of healthy, loving relationships with other people. That's who Christ is. That's what we're called to. That's what we're made for. The nature of man gives rise to the natural moral law, which Professor Rooney talked about in the last lecture so beautifully. Within that natural law, each person has equal human dignity, which is the source of all personal rights. Human and civil rights exist to safeguard the person from unjust violations of his or her God-given human dignity. In Veritatis Splendor, St. John Paul II explains the relationship between the natural law and human dignity. He says, at this point, the true meaning of the natural law can be understood. It refers to man's proper and primordial nature, the nature of the human person, which is the person himself in the unity of soul and body, and the unity of his spiritual and biological inclinations, and of all the other specific characteristics necessary for the pursuit of his end. The natural moral law expresses and lays down the purposes, rights, and duties which are based upon the bodily and spiritual nature of the human person. Therefore, this law cannot be thought of as simply a set of norms on the biological level. Rather, it must be defined as a rational order whereby man is called by the Creator to direct and regulate his life and actions, and in particular, to make use of his own body. Because God bestows dignity upon all persons, the natural law prohibits governments from infringing on that which God has given. Therefore, under the natural law, nation states, including the United States, of course, have a moral obligation to respect and protect human dignity and to recognize and protect those rights consistent with each person's dignity. And so this gives us some grounding. This is not exhaustive. I could have gone into justice, didn't want to do that given the time. But this is the Catholic vision of who we are as persons. We are gifts of God, out of the breath of God, out of his love. We are created by the Lord for love to come back to love. And Rand says the deepest desire of the person is survival. The reality is that's not true. The deepest desire of the person is to give and to receive sacrificial love. You know this from human existence. You know this from your own times, the pains and the trials of loving someone, and the joy and the freedom that gives you. And so we're made for this community. That's what we're called to. Tragically, and not coincidentally, the problem in healthcare today is fundamentally about broken relationships. The central problem of healthcare today is that man has turned away from God and man has turned away from each other, thereby breaking the communion that is central to health, wellness, and human flourishing. The Harvard Study on Adult Development is a study that Harvard University researchers have conducted for 80 years, beginning in 1938, to determine those factors that most contribute to long life, human flourishing, and happiness. The study examined the lives of over 2,000 people for several generations. And according to this renowned and highly respected project, the number one determinant of long life is relationships, or what we would understand as being in communion with others in loving loving, healthy relationships with family and friends. In an interview with McKinsey and Company, the study's director, Robert Waldinger, said the following. What it is, and this is from last year, what is it that we found that really contributes to well-being? This is the project's director. There were two big items over 85 years. One is taking care of your health, of our health. The part that surprised us was that people who were happiest, who stayed healthiest as they grew old, and who lived the longest were the people who had the warmest connections with other people. In fact, good relationships were the strongest predictor of who was going to be happy and healthy as they grew old. Relationships, #1 indicator of long life. What happens when a person does not have a healthy community, healthy relationships, or from the Catholic perspective, lacks a loving community? When a person is seriously socially disconnected or isolated from others, such a lack of community can have negative health consequences that are the equivalent of the consequences of smoking 14 cigarettes every single day, according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Serious social isolation contributes to increased risks of stroke, heart disease, and other poor health outcomes. The U.S. Surgeon General was so concerned about social isolation occurring nationwide that last summer he officially issued an advisory report entitled Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation, the U.S. Surgeon General Advisory on the Healing Effects of Social Connection and Community. So this is just clear. It's really, the more that you look at medical research, the more that I have, I'm on the boards of 2 different Catholic healthcare entities. I do a lot of work in this area. I did a lot of work at HHS, a secular organization. The more you dig deeper, whether as a practitioner or whether as a lawyer, into the reality of the human person and what makes for health benefits, long life, and flourishing, the more you see, at least I see as a Catholic, that God designed the body. And because God designed the body, there is significant research showing the reality that prayer, religious exercise, religious community also has tremendous health benefits. Tragically, however, the throwaway culture of death has risen within today's healthcare system, and it's gravely, seriously attacking what we just talked about. It's attacking our communion with God, our desire for communion with God, and it's attacking our innate desire for communion with other people. I'm not going to belabor this point, but I want to give a short summary of this attack. What we see to varying degrees in this throwaway culture of death is a desire for absolute autonomy of the individual, a moral relativism in which there's no truth, a drive for the secular state to replace God and family, and a lust for total power. In today's prevailing culture, man is attempting to remove any restraints placed upon him by God through creation and is seeking a utopia here on earth. In this utopia, the spirit of the age man seeks to throw down God and seeks to become God itself. This throwaway culture of death, the spirit of the age, is manifesting itself in extraordinary violations of human freedom, human dignity, and religious freedom. This includes a lot of things that you will all, that we're all aware of, some things that perhaps some of us aren't as much. But we see the radical expansion of abortion, the killing of an unborn child, nationally and globally, as a right to reproductive freedom. A false right, we would say. We also see the expansion of the intentional killing of the sick and other people who live lives not worth living through various forms of euthanasia, including various forms of assisted suicide. That's happening in the United States. It's even worse in Canada and in Europe. We see a growing passive euthanasia in the United States through patients being starved in hospices, intentionally over-medicating patients to hasten their death, and the use of the medically false brain death diagnosis as a means of dispensing with patients perceived to, again, have lives not worth living, whose organs are deemed valuable, and who have become too costly to continue to care for them. We also see ongoing discrimination against patients with disabilities, patients who come from materially poor socioeconomic backgrounds, discrimination against immigrants, and historically racial and ethnic minorities. We also see the federal government and some state governments engaging in serious violations of religious freedom and medical conscience rights and mandating medical professionals, healthcare entities to perform abortions, so-called transgender procedures, and other unethical and harmful procedures that gravely violate the dignity of the person. We also see the secular healthcare industry and some aspects of the industry seeking to drive faith and religion completely out of healthcare. In total, in healthcare, we are in the midst of a myriad efforts to break man's communion of love with God and people for which man has been made for. The spirit of the age seeks to replace this communion with man's insatiable lust for power and control, and to dominate those considered to be unfit, unplanned, and unworthy. So what does this mean for Catholic healthcare? So what I'm going to do here, just hopefully close within about 10 minutes, but a little bit of a vision of what Catholic healthcare should look like, and just to sketch out the principles that should undergird a American healthcare system informed by Catholic anthropology. Catholic healthcare professionals and medical entities should be focused on creating centers of care that are Christ-centered, that foster communion with God, and healing for that patient's whole person and body, mind, and soul. In Catholic healthcare entities, medical professionals to seek to love their patients by providing prayerful, cutting-edge medical treatment and care that addresses the integrated human person. Catholic medical professionals should, if their patients consent to it, pray for their patients supernaturally through the power of the Holy Spirit, even while working tirelessly to alleviate suffering and to heal the patient through natural means. This is a growing movement within the renewal of Catholic healthcare and within the Catholic medical professional world. Catholic hospitals and healthcare entities should be centers of divine mercy and healing, in which patients, as they walk and encounter the divine physician through loving physical medical care, mental health services, the offering of the sacraments, and the offering of prayer ministry. In the case of secular healthcare institutions, they should be focused also on the healing of the whole person, recognizing that the greatest determinant of health is being in relationship with God and agape love with other people. This means that secular medical institutions should respect the well-formed medical conscience and religious freedom convictions of medical professionals and patients. And we know that that right is central not only to the person's human dignity, but also to their health. Along the same lines, we should allow secular medical entities to give life and breath to the natural and supernatural reality that a life of God, a life in communion with God and others, is central to one's health. It's just another reason why the rights of families and patients should be respected and protected. The policies of secular healthcare entities also have a moral obligation to respect and protect a patient's access to prayer and the sacraments, especially the Eucharist, confession, and the anointing of the sick. Within reason, medical professionals and medical practices should encourage patients to foster real and healthy community. Policies of healthcare entities should seek to facilitate and maximize a patient's access to family and friends. On both of these fronts, the federal government, state governments, local governments, healthcare entities, and even many Catholic dioceses tragically failed to respect and protect and care for the life and dignity of patients during the COVID-19 crisis, which I won't go into. Lastly, we're going to just sketch out the principles of the principles for healthcare law and policy, given this Catholic anthropology. And some of this is based on work that I've helped out with at the Catholic Medical Association, also the Catholic Healthcare Leadership Alliance. First, the center of healthcare law should be the life and dignity of the human person. In passing healthcare laws and in promulgating healthcare regulations, it is legitimate and appropriate to consider cost, financial sustainability. However, every healthcare law at the local, state, and federal level should be chiefly concerned with how each law ultimately impacts the life, health, and dignity of patients and consumers, particularly those that are most vulnerable. We also know that there has to be a right to life. Every single law and policy in our country should pass the test of being consistent with the right to life. St. John Paul II said that the inviolability of the person, which is a reflection of the absolute inviolability of God, finds its primary and fundamental expression in its inviolability of human life. Above all, he says, the common outcry, which is justly made on behalf of human rights, for example, the right to health, to home, to work, to family, to culture, these rights are false and illusory if the right to life, the most basic and fundamental right, and the condition for all other personal rights, is not defended with maximum determination. We also know that we have, because of this right to life, a right to medical care, that every person has a right to medical care. Now, this does not mean that the government must secure the actual access to that care, but that we as a civil society have a duty out of justice and out of human dignity to provide for the care of God's people in our country. We also recognize, and I already talked about this, that there is a robust right to religious freedom, medical conscience rights, not just for the medical professional, but also for the patient. We have laws in our country, the First Amendment, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, the federal medical conscience laws, that really provide fairly strong legal protections, but we need to do much more. Fifth, there's two more. Patient freedom and their appropriate ability to exercise control over their medical decision-making is absolutely fundamental to human dignity, that human beings exercise true freedom and control of those medical interventions that they receive or do not receive. Continuing along those lines, another principle would be non-discrimination in healthcare. Tragically, civil rights violations, particularly for persons with disabilities and also for immigrants, is still very rampant within our healthcare system. There's an opportunity to advance and increase those legal protections for persons with disabilities, persons that are aged and elderly, and those with chronic diseases. Finally, as Professor Carter-Snead wonderfully illustrates in his book, What It Means to Be Human, our country, in its medical care, needs a renewal of the reality of the human person, that the human person is made for communion. The Catholic anthropology is the reality of our existence, and it is a reality that leads to indescribable joy, freedom, fulfillment, and ultimately love. This Catholic anthropology needs to be shared and spread in our medical and law schools, in our nursing schools, and in other schools of training for healthcare vocations. It needs to be reintroduced into our medical practices, our healthcare entities, our healthcare laws and regulations, even at a secular level. Again, the spirit of the age is chiefly concerned with domination, with power, with absolute autonomy, and exalting the state and the creature above the creator. However, on this feast of Our Lady of the Rosary, we are reminded that God's love is more powerful than all evil put together, and that God's love and the reality of the communion that we are called to, and the reality of his healing through healthcare will persevere the greatest of evil. Thank you.
Well, wonderful. Thank you very much. We have a little bit of time for some questions from the audience. Maybe I'll get the ball rolling with a couple of questions of Marcelo, is a very rich and interesting talk. So I have two questions, a kind of a
Sure.
bigger question and then a more specific one on the basis of something that you said. That's more of a kind of historical question. But the big question is, if you were to describe the one or two major challenges that Catholic healthcare, that Catholic medical services organizations face today, whether those challenges be regulatory or cultural or whatever they may, what would they be? What are the sort of the major challenges either now or coming down the road, let's say in about, within the next 5 years?
Yeah, so I would say that some of the state laws and regulations and some of the federal laws and regulations are so serious that it would essentially break Catholic healthcare. The Catholic healthcare, at least from a moral theological standpoint, is in the United States is governed by the ethical and religious directives for Catholic healthcare services that the bishops promulgate every so many years. What's happening is that what's between state and federal mandates, should these things not be struck down by the court, which it could, but we could have a court expansion in the next couple of years, who knows? It would make it, and the law would be such that it would be impossible for a Catholic to actually practice Catholic care because of those mandates. So these are existential threats to the legal continuation of Catholic healthcare in the United States. That's the biggest issue. I would say number two would be the failure, it would be a Catholic identity issue. The failure of Catholic healthcare entities to live out its actual mission. I was on a panel with I think it was the CEO of, I want to say he might have been the CEO of Common Spirit at Notre Dame Law School, and a medical professional that you actually might know. She's a medical professor at Columbia University School of Medicine. And I talked about healthcare being to love the patient. And she said, critiquing her own system, that I don't see that where I work. I don't see us trying to love the patient. I see us trying to dominate the body. What she spoke to is a certain human arrogance that they can overcome the restraints of the body. They're not really interested in loving the patient. That mentality has kind of infected a lot of Catholic healthcare. And it's not only bad for the mission, but it's bad for, as a friend of mine would say, it's bad for the margin. It's bad for the financial sustainability of Catholic hospitals and healthcare entities. So
that's great. So then the second question is, you mentioned the arrival of, this is a historical question. So the arrival of the hospital.
Yeah.
As its own independent entity. And of course, today we just sort of think hospitals are synonymous with healthcare. But one of the things that you mentioned in the talk was that it's actually the Christian and Catholic conception of healthcare that brought about the rise of the hospital. And it reminded me, for those that don't know, Anthony Trollope, who is a 19th century English writer, talks about this in one of his novels. That's sort of the combination of the hospital. Like, it was called a hospital, but it was really almost like a nursing home.
Sure, that's right.
A home for the care of the sick
Mm-hmm.
and the needy, combination organization. So do you know some more about that?
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I was doing a law review article for this law journal and policy that hopefully will come out next year, and did some research on this, because you wonder, is it really is an exaggeration? And I think it's really kind of fundamentally true. The notion, the concept of we as a civil society or a community are going to care for the sick and the suffering amongst us just because we love them just did not exist until the gospel came and early Christian communities sprang up. Just didn't happen. The earliest tracing of a hospital, I think, that we know of, based on scholarship, would be, I believe it was Basel, and I'm going to get the city wrong. I believe it was in modern day Turkey, and they started. They started caring for the sick. There is contemporary primary source materials that saying before this kind of hospital was created, and again, hospital I'm using somewhat loosely, and before Christians moved in, just bodies lying on the street. I mean, it's kind of It seems a little bit much, but if you do the research, it's really there. It just didn't, this conception of healthcare that we understand. And then the notion of we're just gonna care for the sick because we care just did not exist. And you can see some of that by the way that before Christ came, the way that in some situations the sick were treated as they were kind of outcast, they were ostracized. You did something bad, you've been cursed. It's the exact reverse, you know, with the Knights of Malta, for instance, that have a devotion to caring for the sick. The idea is that we're slaves of the poor. You know, that we are there to serve our lords, the poor. That's a radical transformation. And it was really from the scholarship that I've seen, including primary source materials from the 300s or 400s. It really was the first hospital. I believe it was St. Basil. I believe it was Turkey. I don't remember the exact location.
Thanks. Other questions? Don't be shy.
You mentioned that there's a universal right to healthcare, but that doesn't mean that the government should subsidize healthcare for everyone. So what is your vision for meeting that need for healthcare?
Yeah, and I would say, hopefully it's not mine, but it's more like what the church would suggest. I would say that, you know, prudentially, given the extent to which the culture, and Bill and I have talked about this, the extent to which the culture is kind of given over to this throwaway objectification of the person, doing a single payer Medicare for all in this environment would be a disaster. You know, what you see happen too often in different countries, you know, that socialized medicine, it often it's done from a desire to provide the care, but essentially people start becoming budget line items that you can cut. It becomes a real problem. And so ideally what would happen is that you have a combination of subsidiarity and solidarity, right? That you have the individual who takes personal responsibility, his family who supports him, the community, the church, local religious health institutions, local private health institutions, with state and local social safety nets, and state and local healthcare entities in the private market, providing access to care for the person, the government supporting that to the extent that it's required by you know, local and state healthcare entities and state government entities, but not more than that. The idea of a government takeover of healthcare is not ideal. Now, part of that is a prudential judgment, but it's also, you know, if the analogy I like to use is if my house is on fire and you're, you know, I'm in DC, I'm in Brookland, and you're in California, you can pray for me. God can work with that, but your natural capacity to help me with my fire is very limited because you're all the way in California. If you're a block away, or if you're in Silver Spring and you have a much higher natural capacity. So with subsidiarity and solidarity, it's not just a principle, but it's actually the capacity for loving. The acute capacity for loving and caring for the unique needs of the individual is much higher when you practice subsidiarity and take care of and handle and treat and care for the person closest to where the person is.
My question is about the trends with the pharmaceutical industry, the healthcare industry. What's your view on the closeness of the pharmaceutical industry with FDA and CDC?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. I had to really restrain myself. You know, this was probably maybe 10 minutes longer than I should have gone, but there, you know, I could talk about this forever. It's a huge issue. I think probably the chief problem in the pharmaceutical industry is that you kind of have industry capture of the regulatory state, and it's just a problem, and it's going to take a long time. And so I'll leave it at that. Yeah, it's a
Do you
huge.
have any solutions? Because you have so much experience, like what would be like the first step to take to try to roll that back? Or?
I actually don't know the answer to that. I do know enough to say that it's a real problem, and people aren't crazy when they say that there's issues with, you know, where the industry is kind of captured the regulatory agencies, but you know, that deal with that. But there's so much money and it's so built in, it's really hard to know, because there's a lot of work done in the pharmaceutical industry that's great, right? It's really good. But there's challenges. And so I don't know the answer to that, but it's probably at a minimum, it's a concentration of too much power, not enough oversight. And it's a diminishment on some level of human dignity, in the sense that it is there's a disproportionate power and control in terms of how our healthcare is administered and what the consumer actually understands his or her options are.
There's a very wide focus in healthcare about ethics
Mhm.
and the bounds by which ethics inform every case.
Sure.
How do we engage, whether they're an institution or provider who is firmly well grounded in their perspective of what the ethical bounds are, and bring this conversation to that from that perspective?
Right, yeah, so, and you're saying, assuming that they're secular, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the beauty is that, I think generally speaking, in every case that I've seen, the church's understanding of the human person, and even, for instance, the teaching on sexuality, it's not just, perhaps the right thing to do, so, quote unquote, right thing to do, or the thing that's gonna keep you out of the confessional. But it actually leads to superior healthcare outcomes. I remember when the former state director of the Texas Health Department showed me, I want to say it was longevity in the state of Texas, where it was greatest, from what I remember. The correlation was high rates of community and low abortion rates. Which is the first time I really started understanding there's something about this community thing. That was years ago. And so I think looking into this, to medical research, looking into biomedical research, looking into the science, what causes human flourishing? And this is again, the beauty, what I'm saying is faith and reason line up. Faith and reason line up. Because, you look at, for instance, another example, the massive pullback on so-called gender affirming care, transgender procedures, sex reassignment surgeries, puberty blockers, all that. Why has there been a massive pullback in Europe? It's one of the most socialist parts of our world. It's also a place where, kind of atheism and agnosticism is going through the roof. It's not because of exuberance and zeal for Christian faith. It's because the medical science and research on those procedures is horrid, and people are aghast, and they're pulling back. It has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with, like right-wing conservatism. It's just the reality of what happens to the human person when procedures that are harmful are done to them. And so I would say in a secular setting, you go for, again, the good, the true, the beautiful. What does the research say? And point ways where you should see it almost in every instance, I would say. Again, I know it sounds, remarkable, but that's what I've seen, where the good bioethics aligns with good moral teaching, which aligns with great health outcomes, which aligns with human flourishing.
What astonishes me, I suppose, is the capture by people who are not in accord with the Catholic vision of the word healthcare. And so healthcare will govern such things as abortion, transgender stuff, euthanasia, assisted suicide, the idea of brain death and so forth. But it will all be put under both healthcare and human dignity. And so there seems to be essentially a contest for what the right meaning of those words is. And from a secular perspective, it seems to be that healthcare is simply desired bodily procedures by whoever the agent is. It may be the patient or it may be a power of attorney, according to their vision of autonomy. And the outcome of that preference is called healthcare and an exercise of the decision maker's dignity. Now, you helpfully quoted Veritatis Splendor, and particularly in that encyclical, John Paul talks about the inseparability of the body and the soul. And if one thinks about the body and its proper ends, it is perhaps the surest way to understand what health is.
Sure, yes.
So that something going under the term of reproductive rights results in the death and mutilation of a being of the humankind.
Right.
that is not in accord with the purpose and end of that human being.
Right.
In a transgender world, we are indeed cutting directly against the proper ends of perfectly healthy
Sure.
bodily parts. For euthanasia, we're saying we don't need to wait for natural death because somebody's dignity requires us to decide that that life shall not be nourished, but extinguished.
Right.
So the point really is, it seems to be the intersection between Catholic and secular healthcare seems to begin over the understanding of what healthcare is.
No, that's right. That's exactly right. And that's why you guys are probably wondering, he's talking about, like, he's quoting scripture and we're talking about healthcare, like what? It's exactly the point. Because if we don't know what this is, there's no way to get to, it's exactly why this is all, it's all off. You know, you have in certain states in the United States, you know, you had the scandal from a couple of years ago. I want to keep you guys, but scandal from a couple of years ago was an insurance company on the West Coast was willing to pay for the person's assisted suicide, but not for some relatively inexpensive medical treatment the person sought, and essentially gave them the paper saying, you know, gave them a letter saying exactly that, right? We have, you know, even, you know, not even getting into the abortion, the transgender issues, but just looking at assisted suicide, you have people in Canada that are just, you know, they're depressed or there's other issues, and they're calling, they call it, medical assistance, medical aid in dying, or medical assistance in dying, MAID. They're calling that healthcare. They're literally calling drugs and procedures and financing just to murder people healthcare. We're not even talking about terminally ill people. And so that's exactly right. It is the anthropology issue. It's also like people don't know the gospel, they don't know the truth of, you know, but that's probably even more fundamental, but it's also this anthropological issue. Yeah, please.
But for this crowd of law students, we have to consider the relationship between law and nature. That is, we think about deconstructionism as a sort of literary tool and sort of trying to dissect and dissemble the social structure. This is a form of legal constructivism in which the law is going to construct, as you say,
Right.
healthcare and law are so closely intersected.
Right.
They're going to construct a mental, willful vision of what they call healthcare that is dissociated from reality.
Right. That's exactly the point.
So they will say abortion is healthcare because they want the right to terminate the pregnancy without recognizing that the concept of healthcare and the law surrounding healthcare has to arise from the roots of reality itself.
Right.
The Catholic perspective is natural death, not the respirator ad infinitum, but and even not the feeding tube ad infinitum if the body cannot assimilate the nourishment. But if the body can assimilate the nourishment, the body deserves the feeding tube.
Right.
But it's an ethos that is grounded in reality. And as lawyers, I don't think we can lose sight of the importance of ensuring that law is grounded in reality, including the definition of a legal person compared to a natural person.
I would concur. Yeah, please.
One more, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
On that note, and thinking about how even Dobbs versus Jackson pushed the decision, to legalize abortion to the states, basically saying we're a pluralistic society and everybody needs to sort of like, a reasonable person can differ on their idea of like a human person. Is this the kind of deal where can we ever expect help from like the Supreme Court or the American justice system to come to this understanding of reality, or is it just baked in the nature to say it's whatever the greatest number of people say it is?
Yeah, I think we have to and we can. And Professor Girolami has done a lot of writing kind of on some of that. And we have a lot of discussions, but No, I think it can be done, like, it can be done, but it's gonna take time. I think that there were, both in healthcare and in law, there's been a lot of deception, I think, in the last 100 years, right? And a lot of skepticism. And it's a real pull towards a moral relativism, because it's just easier, just give people what they want. We have a natural tendency to just want to do what we want to do, even when we know it's bad for us or not good for us or it's harming somebody else. And so we have a duty as either people of faith or simply people that see the truth as people of goodwill, to reform these structures that Professor Rooney talked about. And that's the project. You know, I think that's the grand adventure. Even in your own little, like, whether you become a Supreme Court justice or the president of the United States, you know, or a general counsel for an IT company that's got to deal with artificial intelligence, that's the project, is to think within this reality. Again, it's not been imposed. We're not imposing anything. We're living within the reality, and we're helping people to live within the reality, and we're helping human beings to flourish, and to experience the joy and the fullness of their God-given freedom. That's the project. So we have to, regard, even when the chips are down, like they seem like they are right now, we have to do so. And also, last point I would say, we have to do so with a real commitment to that reality, even beyond party or race, or these things are the transcendent things that we should pursue as lawyers or as medical professionals. So.
Great, well, thank you. So I'm afraid we're out of time. Please, if you have any questions for him, please ask him. Or,
Oh, really?
Yeah, no, it's really,
Yeah.